this video, part 3 of our sewing CLO tutorial, I'm going to talk about how to fix sewing lines if your sewing is twisted or bunched up or messed up. You maybe notice something after you simulate, or you notice your threads being twisted after you sew them together. In this video, we're going to talk about how you can fix your sewing if that happens, and then also how you can edit your sewing or adjust it. And so we have our dress here that we've been working on in parts 1 and 2 of our sewing tutorial. And if you missed those videos, you can go back and watch them. Part 1 is about segment sewing, and part 2 is about free sewing, and it helped us sew this dress together. If you did ever have a mistake when you were sewing, it's always pretty easy to fix it. I'm going to go into our history and just go right before we turned on simulation mode. That way I can show you how you'll be able to tell if you have a twisted notch in your sewing. So I'm going to twist the notch here on our rectangular side seam just so we can see what that looks like. And to do that, I'm going to go into our edit sewing tool, which is that sewing machine icon right here with the cursor next to it, and just click on that seam and click delete so that it's gone. And I'm going to go back into our free sewing. And this time I'm purposely going to twist my notches. So I placed the notch at the top of this part of the seam and the bottom of this part. So it's sewing this half to this half, which we know is wrong. And the reason I like to have threads on while I'm sewing here in the 3D window is because then I can easily tell, oh, this is incorrect. This notch is twisted because they are crisscrossed like this. But if I were to turn on simulation mode, this is basically what would happen. This is a really small seam, so it's not going to mess up the whole garment, but you can see it's not going to lay how it should be. And if it were on a bigger seam, it would mess it up even more. But if that ever happens, one really easy way to fix it is to go back into our edit sewing tool and right click on the seam and click reverse sewing. And that will flip one of the notches to match. And then when I turn on simulation again, you can see now it will lay nicer and how it should be, and the seam will be correct. There's also a couple of other things that we can do in our edit sewing tool up here in the 2D toolbar. And this can give us some information about our sewing. For example, if I hover over any seam line, and the number is blue, that tells me that my sewing line is even. So here, the number next to my cursor is 0. That means there's a 0-inch difference between these two seam lines. And then it has the measurement of each of them. But if I have a seam that is uneven and I hover over it, it will be red. And red doesn't necessarily mean the seam is wrong, because sometimes we want our seam to be gathered like this one. But it can be helpful to let you know a seam is uneven if you wanted it to be even. So this is telling me there's a 21.982 inch difference between these two seams, or these two sections. One of them's 22 inches and one of them's 44 inches. If I ever wanted to edit my sewing, so for example, maybe I wanted these two sewing edges to be the same, I can always click and drag a part of my sewing line using the edit sewing tool and release it. And that would adjust the sewing line anywhere to make it shorter or longer. And you can see when I am editing it, I get that dark blue dot that appears. And so I could always make the sewing line even if I wanted to. If I were to turn on simulation mode, you can see that it really adjusts the sewing. So now that sewing line is flat, but we do have this extra fabric over here. If I wanted to adjust the whole seam line instead of just a point, I can always click and drag and move that whole seam line. It will even move around a corner or across a pattern. And then I can always click and drag to edit it back to how I want it to be. In addition to fixing a seam with the reverse sewing technique I showed you, you can also always just go in and delete the sewing and redo it. And to delete any sewing, you'll just click on the edit sewing tool and click on the seam you want to delete, and then click delete on your keyboard. and then I could go in and reapply that sewing. If I wanted to delete multiple pieces of sewing or all of my sewing, I could click and drag to select the area I wanted to delete the sewing from, and then click delete on my keyboard, and it would delete all of the sewing that I had selected. I'm going to click Command Z to reapply both of those sewings that I had just deleted. And the last technique that you can use to check if your sewing is messing up too is to turn on textured surface mode here in the garment rendering style menu on top of our 3D window. That looks like that blue roll of fabric that's white on one side. We could switch from thick textured surface mode, which makes both of our fabric sides look the same, just to textured surface mode, which would allow us to see the back side of the fabric as having a shadow on it. So if I move this piece of fabric out, you can see now the back has a shadow on it, versus in textured surface mode, both sides look the same. And so this could be a way to check if your sewing is incorrect, because if when we were arranging our pattern pieces, maybe for example, we accidentally placed our sleeves on the wrong arrangement points. So I'm going to turn on my arrangement points with Shift F and arrange these sleeves on the wrong arms. You can see now that when I'm looking at these threads, the seam lines are not matching up. So the seam line here on this front armhole, the threads are not connecting to this sleeve. And if I pull it far enough out, I can actually see they're crossed. And so one technique to check if your garment is not simulating correctly is to check to make sure your fabric is facing the correct way, and also that you have arranged the pieces on the correct side and that they're not flipped. Because if I were to turn on simulation mode with it like this, it would not simulate correctly. So if you're having something like this happen, then it's probably an arrangement error. If you missed any of the other videos about how to apply sewing in CLO, you can go back to part 1 to learn about segment sewing and part 2 to learn about free sewing.